Global warming remains the world's most talked about subject. I believe that global warming is a serious issue that we as humans need to take a stand to stop. Global warming is a gradual increase in the overall temperature of the Earth's atmosphere, generally attributed to the greenhouse effect caused by increased levels of carbon dioxide, chlorofluorocarbons, and other pollutants. As stated from NASA, the atmosphere today contains more greenhouse gas molecules, so more of the infrared energy emitted by the surface ends up being absorbed by the atmosphere. Since some of the extra energy from a warmer atmosphere radiates back down to the surface, Earth's surface temperature rises. The global average surface temperature rose 0.6 to 0.9 degrees Celsius between 1906 and 2005, and the rate of temperature increase has nearly doubled in the last 50 years. Temperatures are certain to go up further. The current warming trend is of particular significance because most of it is very likely human-induced and proceeding at a rate that is unprecedented in the past 1,300 years. Some major evidence that has been shown majorly is global sea level rose about 17 centimeters in the last century. The rate in the last decade, however, is nearly double that of the last century. The Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets have decreased in mass. Data from NASA's Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment show Greenland lost 36 to 60 cubic miles of ice per year between 2002 and 2006, while Antarctica lost about 36 cubic miles of ice between 2002 and 2005.
How do we know that humans are the ones that are causing the CO2 emissions?
So we know that human processes actually generate CO2 emissions. Now, there are a lot of sources of CO2 emissions, but simple acts like breathing cause CO2 emissions, and then particularly the conversion of fossil fuels to energy. The chemistry is pretty straightforward on that. You generate a CO2 emission when that happens.
Okay, sea levels are rising dangerously at a rate that has accelerated with increasing human greenhouse gas emissions, thereby threatening small islands and coastal communities. What can we do to stop so much greenhouse gases and CO2 emissions?
The kind of obvious low-hanging fruit is to look towards a transition to alternative technologies that are less reliant on carbon-based power, and try to move away from the generation of that. And in terms of greenhouse emissions, when your dad and I were kids, everything was aerosol can, and there were all these CFCs that were killing ozone, wrecking the ozone layer, and putting all kinds of things in the atmosphere that are still there today, 20 years later. And it takes a while for that to dissipate. In fact, I think the last thing I read, it's not clear to me that there's even been sort of a steady state achieved where there's no longer a growth in the CFCs from aerosol type containers. But there have been a lot of things that have been done in the last couple of decades to begin looking at mitigating the kinds of things we put in the atmosphere. Say just more of the same, and you've got to always have an eye open for new technologies.
Polar bears and other Arctic and Antarctic wildlife are unable to adapt to anticipated local climate change effects, independent of the causes of those changes. Do you think that with all the changes that are going to happen, that there's going to be a chance that the animals that can't adapt to the changes of global warming could go extinct?
There are extinction patterns, and people who are resistive to the idea that humans have a big footprint in global warming or climate change will point to those, and that is the case. There are sometimes catastrophic episodes that are completely beyond human control that might cause drastic climatological changes, and certainly cause extinction events. And relative to some of those things, certainly what we're seeing in terms of climate change right now is a relatively slow-moving process, but it's a slow-moving process for which we understand the science, and we might be able to mitigate things a little bit and slow things down. So, but yes, I think that there is a chance that there are species that are in danger of certainly losing their habitat, and a naturally existing habitat So, I mean, you may see polar bears in zoos from here to eternity because they're a big draw. But as their climate changes, if adaptations are made, that's certainly always possible.
Do emissions of carbon dioxide from human activity have a big impact on Earth's climate?
But based on the science as I understand it, certainly there is a significant impact. That being said, the Earth's climate is a huge and complicated thing. If you were to put a scale model of the Earth, 1,000 feet tall, out on the commons on the campus right now, this little town that we're in would not even be discernible as a speck on that. So when we talk about the climate of the whole planet, it's really big and it's really complicated, and there are geological and geophysical things that influence climate and environment. There are extraterrestrial things. Some of the biggest jolts to climate in the past, if we look through the geological record, are the result of things like asteroids, large asteroids hitting the planet. Again, hundreds of millions of years ago. So there are things that have a more abrupt impact on climate, but certainly the science is pretty clear that there are things that human beings can control that do, at present, add to the problem and that can be mitigated. So, I mean, in the whole picture of climate change and whether or not the globe's warming, there are a lot of variables, many of which we have no control over whatsoever, but those that we do, we do.
Is it too late to do anything about climate change?
Well, so if one thinks that, one would probably have a hard time getting out of bed in the morning. So I think it's never too late to do what can be done on whatever level you can accomplish it. And that could be through pursuing and advocating for policy initiatives that would change our habits on a large scale, all the way down to just the decisions you make each day. It's something as simple as setting the thermostat to 68 degrees in your house instead of 73. It makes a little bit of a difference. At some point in time, we may be confronted more abruptly with the need to make a drastic change, but I don't feel like we're there yet, but we're probably pretty close. So, not too late, but wouldn't mind seeing habits change at some point in time.
Is there any significant impacts that global warming has had on humans? And if so, what are they?
Well, so, I mean, fundamentally, I think you've seen islands in the Pacific start to disappear that are populated by humans. So those humans would have an immediate visceral response of yes to this. Even things like the models suggest increased frequency and increased intensity of ocean-based storms. So things like the typhoon in the Philippines this last week, or hurricanes in the Gulf Coast region and stuff. And again, it's still kind of early in these predictions. So is this due to random chance or is this due to climate change? Is open for discussion, but I would say yes. Human beings have already started to feel this, and in the long run, I suppose my concern, being where I'm at, this is a resource-driven institution with a focus on pulling fossil fuels out of the earth and converting those to energy. But if we look at sort of the long-term resource issues, I think in another half century, wars probably won't be fought over oil, they'll be fought over water. Because that is a commodity without which human beings or animals, for that matter, can't survive. And we are not adapted to salt water.
The Earth has not warmed significantly for the past 16 years, despite an 8% increase in atmospheric CO2, which represents 34% of all extra CO2 added to the atmosphere since the start of the Industrial Revolution. We conclude no extreme evidence exists for adverse changes to the global environment caused by human-related CO2 emissions. In particular, sea level rise is not accelerating. No systematic changes have been documented in evaporation or rainfall or in the magnitude or intensity of extreme meteorological events, and an increased release of methane into the atmosphere from permafrost or subseed gas hydrates is unlikely.